The webinar today that we're going to share is to tell or not to tell how to approach trauma histories. To start off with, I'll give a little introduction of myself. My name is Darcy Solom, and I have been with the Post-Adopt since January of 2020. I obtained my social work degree from the University of North Dakota in 2018, and I served the Northeast region of North Dakota. So I served primarily the orange and the green areas that you can see on the map. I enjoy being a resource for families, whether it be a listening ear, connecting families to resources, or helping through a difficult time. In my free time, I enjoy a good cup of coffee and playing with my puppy, Kona. During this presentation, I'm going to go over some tidbits about trauma, how it affects a person, what to look for at various stages during childhood, the need for parents to understand trauma, and then I'll jump into why kiddos need to understand their trauma history and considerations to take when sharing trauma history with our kiddos. So to start off with, trauma defined. Trauma is an emotional response to any event that threatens or causes harm to an individual. Some examples of trauma that we often see within the adoption realm include abuse, whether it be physical, sexual, or emotional, neglect, whether it be educational neglect, medical neglect, or neglect of basic needs such as food, clothing, or shelter. We also see trauma in the effects of poverty, such as homelessness or not having enough to eat. We may also see kiddos affected by being separated from loved ones. And we can also see with that having multiple caregivers. That can be kind of a traumatic experience for our kiddos. Also, our kiddos may witness harm to a loved one or to a pet, and this could be either from domestic violence or community violence. And then our kiddos may also experience unpredictable parental behavior due to addiction or mental illness. Those affected by trauma may have a singular experience with a particular event, which is defined as an acute trauma. So, our kiddos may experience a single unit of trauma, like a tornado, for example. That can be a traumatic event, but they might not experience a tornado, day in and day out, or even year after year. It may just be a one-time singular experience. But then we also have kiddos who experience trauma multiple times, such as having multiple experiences of physical abuse or experiences. Our kiddos may experience various traumas like physical abuse, food insecurities, multiple caregivers, and these experiences are coined as chronic trauma. So, like I said, just that multiple occurrences with trauma experiences. And then trauma may affect each and every person differently, meaning what may be a traumatic event and cause an emotional response to one person may not cause the same response in another. So we can even see this in our sibling sets. We may have, the older sibling be affected by X, Y, and Z trauma, and then their younger sibling is affected a little bit differently or not affected at all by a particular experience. And then it's important to know whether kiddos have that singular experience or multiple experiences, so that acute trauma or the chronic trauma, as well as how they respond to traumas, because it helps us understand our kiddos a bit more, and it helps us as parents and other caregivers and professionals understand the behaviors that may be exhibited by our kiddos. So trauma can impact kiddos in a variety of different ways, but they can be summed up into four primary categories, which would be trauma can affect our kiddos' bodies, it can affect their emotions, it can affect their behavior, and it can affect their brains. So the effect of trauma can be seen within the body, and we may see this by an inability or difficulty to control physical responses to stress. And then interestingly, there also may be chronic illnesses associated by trauma that can follow a person into adulthood. For example, heart disease or obesity that may be stemmed through from the trauma experiences they had as a kiddo. Trauma affects a person's brain. So a person who experiences trauma may have difficulty thinking, learning, or concentrating. They may be impaired with their memory may be impaired, and they might have difficulty switching from one thought or activity to another. Behaviorally, people who experience trauma can have a lack of impulse control. They may show out more aggression. They might fight a bit more, and they may have that running away tendency. And then there also may be substance abuse. Some ways a kiddo may demonstrate being affected emotionally include having lower self-esteem, feelings of being unsafe. There may be a difficulty or an inability to regulate their emotions. There may be difficulty forming attachments to caregivers, and they may have trust issues with others. And then there may be difficulty with forming healthy friendships, and there may be feelings of depression and anxiety. Children may show signs of trauma differently depending on their age. So we'll go over some of those general signs to look out for each age range. We could separate this even into more categories, slim down the categories, but for the sake of this presentation, I just separated into 3 categories of young children, ages 0 to 5, school-age children, ages 6 to 12, and then our teenagers, ages 13 to 18. So young children may show more irritability or fussiness as compared to their peers. They may startle more easily, or they may be difficult to calm. These younger children may exhibit variance in weight when compared to their peers. They may have digestive issues. There may be frequent tantrums. They may imitate traumatic events. And there may be a reluctantness in exploring the world, or they may seem to want to cling to a caregiver. And then children in the young child's age range 0 to 5 may be delayed in reaching physical and language milestones when compared to their peers. And then they may be engaged in activities that are much higher, much more lower than their peers. So we'll now jump into the school-age children, ages 6 to 12. They're the kiddos who experience trauma may have some difficulty paying attention. They may have stomach aches or headaches for no apparent reason. Kiddos in this age range may eat much more or much less than their peers do. And then there may be some behaviors that are significantly younger than what you might expect from somebody that age. For example, there may be thumb sucking, wetting the bed, or a fear of the dark. And then there may be frequent talk of scary things or feelings as well. And finally, we'll jump into our adolescent age. And again, this covers the ages of 13 to 18. So our teens who have experienced trauma, they may talk about trauma often, or they even may deny that it happened. Teens may have some difficulty following the rules. There may be some risky behavior, including but not limited to consuming alcohol or drugs, running from home, getting in trouble with the law. And then teens may be more apt to being tired, such as they might sleep a lot more, or they even may sleep much less than their peers, and they may have some nightmares as well. And then it's important to note too that these behaviors of kiddos who have experienced trauma, because sometimes our kiddos can be easily diagnosed and have treatments, medications, and so on and so forth that aren't working at the core issues of why these behaviors are present. So for example, we might have a kiddo who on the surface level, they may appear to be having trouble paying attention during school lessons. They may appear to be withdrawn, or they may be very active during the times when not appropriate, or even being compared to their peers. They might just display some similarities to ADHD or something of that nature. But if we're not taking into account their trauma, they might lead towards that diagnosis of ADHD, when in reality there's a hypervigilance due to their trauma history. And so there's a hypervigilance to their surroundings, and this kiddo may be trying to determine if they're safe in that setting. And these behaviors that might be then set forth, they're really a response to their trauma. So like I said, it's just really important to kind of look at the entirety of the kid instead of the behaviors that we see at that surface level. And then another thing to keep in mind too, with some of these behaviors, we might see our kiddos have that biological age of 4, 6, 8, 13, 16, 18. So we might have this biological age, but then we also have to consider an emotional age of where the kiddo is at as well, because sometimes our behaviors will reflect a much younger age. So next we'll jump into some factors that influence the impact of trauma. So as you can see on the screen, there might be some things to consider in helping understand how trauma might have affected a kiddo. So we'll start off with the age of the child when they experienced this trauma event. So one of the things that is a common misconception about trauma is that kiddos who are older may be affected more by a traumatic event. However, studies show that younger children are affected significantly by trauma, as there is more vulnerability the younger the child is when trauma was inflicted. When younger kiddos, such as babies and toddlers, are affected by trauma, they're unable to talk about what happened since there's no language yet, but they do retain traumatic events. So their inability to verbalize the traumatic events can lead to being affected well into adulthood, and we might see behaviors instead of that language piece tied into it. The frequency of trauma should be considered as well. A person who has experienced trauma over and over again, or who has experienced trauma, various types of trauma, might be affected more than a person who has that single traumatic event. So again, kiddos who experience chronic trauma will be potentially more affected than kiddos who have that acute trauma. Relationships should also be considered. Kiddos who have healthy relationships with caregivers are more likely to recover from a traumatic event than those who don't have any healthy relationships or have very limited healthy relationships. This can be very difficult for foster and adoptive parents. It may seem like it's a very personal time for you guys because parents are you as parents of kiddos who have experienced trauma put in so much time and effort in trying to connect with kiddos and build those healthy relationships. And it seems at face value, it seems that kiddos don't want to connect. But remember, it's what we see at that face value isn't always what it appears to be. It is that a little bit deeper. So it might just take more time to connect and to more effort on the parental side to try to connect and continue to show up and try to connect with our kiddo then. And remember that it's not the face value of what we're seeing. Coping skills also play a role into how kiddos are affected. The ability to cope with a traumatic event can depend on the level of intelligence, the physical health, and the self-esteem that person has or that child has when the traumatic event happens. Coping skills can also depend on what they've been taught. So for example, if a kiddo has seen or has been taught how to cope in a healthy manner, they may have the ability to have some healthy coping mechanisms. But if caregivers don't have healthy coping mechanisms, kiddos might not pick up on this. And so it's just important to remember that kiddos might not have the coping mechanisms to kind of handle these traumatic events. Perception can also play a role in how trauma affects a kiddo. How much danger a child thinks that he or she is in, or the amount of fear a child feels at the time of the event is a significant factor in how that child views the particular event to be. So perception can play that huge role in how trauma is affecting the kiddo. And then finally we have that sensitivity piece. And so each child is very different from one another. Some are naturally more sensitive than others. Thus, some may have more struggles in relation to that traumatic event than others may have. So I just wanted to note that kiddos are able to handle a titch bit of stress when there's that healthy relationship with their caretakers, as these stressors can help the kiddo learn, and it can help them develop as well. So some of those healthy stressors may include that feeling of learning to ride a bike on their own for the first time, or going to soccer practice or school for the first day. So, like I said, those are some of those healthy stressors, and kiddos are able to overcome those feelings of that anxiousness or fear, and often experience pleasant feelings after these stressful events, like that riding a bike on their own or going to soccer practice or school the first day, because of the healthy relationships that they have with their caregivers, kind of helping them process through those moments too. However, when our kiddos experience stressful events they can't cope with from the lack of support for recovery, that's when it becomes a problem. So these events that kiddos struggle with rebounding from, they can cause that flight, fight, or freeze response, and kiddos struggle with being able to determine the difference between an event that might help them grow and learn and develop versus something that might be a little bit more stressful. So next, we will jump into why parents why parents need to understand trauma. Oh, it looks like I jumped quite a bit ahead. So it's important for parents to understand a child's trauma history, because it helps to understand the behaviors that are seen within their kiddos. And so we may often see increased aggression. We may see some food hoarding. We may see some bedwetting. We may see some difficulty attaching. And sometimes these behaviors may seem very personal and very frustrating. And so it's good to know of these trauma histories to help us understand that these behaviors are a way of communicating, and parents can help react in a manner that helps connect and heal, rather than to cause more dysregulation within our kiddos and within our home as well. So like again, these behaviors may be saying, hey, I'm scared, hey, I'm dysregulated, hey, I feel unsafe, instead of what the behaviors may seem on that face value. And another helpful piece for parents to know the trauma history of a kiddo is because the parent can help set the kiddo up for success. So parents can learn about the ways of a particular trauma event has affected their child, so the parent can work on meeting the specific needs as it relates to the trauma. So if we have a food insecurity with our kiddo, the parent can help set up various ways in helping that kiddo find some food securities, whether it be having a bowl of healthy snacks set out at all times that kiddos can just have that quick access to. And then it can also be beneficial for parents to learn of the triggers a kiddo has when experiencing some specific traumas. So knowing these triggers can really help in that healing manner. So for example, there's a family that I know the kiddo has a memory of cinnamon, and so cinnamon, as you know, especially around Christmas time, kind of is very, very potent, and I'm sure that we can all attest that cinnamon has a very specific smell. And so, the child has shared, hey, this is my trauma history, this is my experiences with the scent of cinnamon. And so this parent had been talking with their therapist about, how do I connect, what are some pointers, and the therapist had given some really great components and saying, why don't we create pleasant memories with this smell? So the family worked on doing some more fun, more pleasant memories, such as doing some baking together with this spice, which has helped the kiddo to have some more pleasant memories, as opposed to those really not so pleasant memories. And then knowing triggers can also help parents prepare kiddos for situations that can't be avoided, which can, help alleviate some of those behaviors. And so one of the ways of which we can prepare our kiddos, say a kiddo is used to going to school a particular way, that's part of their morning, that's part of their routine. And when the parent has, in the past, when the parent has noticed that behaviors kind of stem from not going that particular way to school, a parent can maybe set up their kiddo for success. And so kind of talking with them, hey, buddy, I know that we're used to going this particular way, but today we're going to have to go another way because there's construction. There's no way we can avoid it. There is construction. So we're going to go this route instead today so we can avoid the construction so we can get to school on time. So just kind of preparing our kiddo to alleviate some behaviors preemptively. And then it's also important to know and understand a kiddo's trauma, as knowing this can help a parent in advocating for services that are needed, whether it be at school, whether it be within therapy, or what have you. Your input is very valuable at various team meetings, because you do know your child very well, so you can know, the strengths and the struggles that your kiddo has, and sharing these can be very important in the various settings. And then it's also just a nice reminder too that sometimes like I had mentioned earlier, sometimes what we see at face value. So sometimes we might think that all these behaviors that are being demonstrated, they may relate to one diagnosis over the other, and we basically want to avoid having our kiddos be misdiagnosed. We want them to be diagnosed adequately and accurately so they can get the maybe medications or therapies that may be beneficial at working towards that root concern of where we're at. And then we'll jump into, does my child need to know their trauma history and why? So as you can see, yes, our children do need to know their trauma history. So children should know the entirety of who they are, and that's including the good stuff as well as that tough stuff, that trauma history. So it's common for parents to want to protect kiddos from the tough parts of their history. And I think that's the natural part of parents. We want to protect, we want to, keep our kiddos safe. We don't want to see them go through that turmoil again. But it's our kiddos' rights to know the entirety of who they are. So, like I said, it's a basic right for our kiddos to know, the entirety of them, the good and the bad. And then know who was involved in shaping, who the person is today. And not sharing this information. So again, not sharing might be perceived by the child that, their trauma history is something that they could be ashamed of not knowing. So that shame is something that we don't want our kiddos to have. So knowing, like talking with our kiddos about their trauma history may seem overwhelming to you as a parent. And it's very common to have, anxieties or questions relating to the subject matter. That's natural, but yes, our kiddos do need to know their trauma history so they can know the entirety of who they are. And again, not only do we want to share their trauma history, but we also want to share go the opposite spectrum too, and share the good that our kiddo has too, their cultural heritage, their racial heritage. We want to share the good along with the tougher stuff. So then we'll jump into, so I covered a little bit of this already, but how much do they need to know? And so I think it's important to note that, like we mentioned, our kiddos need to know the entirety of their history. And so that's the good stuff and the difficult stuff. So this is kind of where you get to do some research on your own as a parent. Find out more about the trauma history, but then also find out a lot more about their heritage as well. So you can piece together the goods and the bads, so that the kiddo can know the entirety of who they are. So when you might have to go back to your kiddo's file that you got when you're adopting. And so with reading through this, it's important to make sure that what you're pulling from those are the factual pieces. So sometimes there may be some wordings of, this writer thinks or whatnot, and so we want to just pull out the factual pieces instead of some of the things that are we think this is we think or we we we're not sure, but we believe that this is what happened. So again, do your research. If there are any questions, it's okay to reach out to the company or the agency that you worked with in adopting, and just kind of go from there. And then finding out more bits and pieces. And then when you do have a pretty good extensive knowledge, it's okay to practice sharing that verbiage too with your kiddo. So like practice with your spouse or practice in front of a mirror, because sometimes finding that right verbiage, it can be maybe uneasy for us, and our kiddos might be able to pick up on that. So, but basically the biggest thing is that yes, we do want to share, and we want to share the facts. And then just to reiterate too that withholding information from a kiddo may deny a kiddo the chance to really know and understand their history. It really denies them the opportunity to know important people and events that did in fact create this human, and it could also deny the kiddo an opportunity to gain some really good coping skills and how to handle this information. So you as the parent can be there to support, to encourage, to aid in appropriate coping skills instead of leaving the kiddo to try to understand the world by themselves. And then we'll jump into next. When do we share their trauma history? So this is also kind of something big to consider too. So it's important to be talking with our kiddos about their adoption story, from the time that they're young. And there's many items that we can include in this, such as the fact that they were adopted, that they have two families, and who makes up those families. They do have a birth mom, they do have a birth dad. What are these names? Who are these people? There might be some birth siblings too, and what have you. With that, there are a few things to consider when sharing a kiddo's trauma history with them. The items of what is shared and how they're shared relating to the trauma history should be dependent on the kiddo's age and then their level of development. So it might not be appropriate to share some of the specific details with a kiddo until they're a bit older. But sharing of the child's general adoption story can be a lifelong conversation. So, again, backing up to when the kiddo is younger, we can maybe just share some of the basics, and then as the child ages, we can share, more and more information. One of the interesting tidbits that I had read on was I had read a few articles by Holly Van Golden. She is I believe she's a therapist. She works a lot with kiddos who have been adopted in their families as well. And so she's very well trained on this subject matter of, when should we share and how should we share and what have you. And so one of the notes that she had noted was that, and I think it's important for us to really consider that too, is that, children should know their full trauma history by the time that between the ages of 9 and 12. That's not to say that you're not sharing their adoption story with them prior to that, but just knowing the full trauma history prior to that. So, and she goes on to explain, children in this age range can address issues, feelings, and concerns before the changes occur during adolescence. And so, there's a lot of changes that happen in our teen years. There's a lot of things that develop in the brain and the body, and kiddos are trying to find out who they are. And so, really processing through a lot of the trauma history prior to that, it's a little bit less stress for our kiddos. as they're entering those adolescent years. And then children between the ages of 9 and 12 are also typically more open to receiving support from their parents as opposed to children in their adolescent years. So this is beneficial because kiddos might come to their parents a little bit more just in general with processing and so yeah, I think I was just glancing at my notes. Sorry about that. Glancing at my notes to see if there was anything else in that key point, but it looks like I've kind of covered that, so we'll kind of move along. So also, it's important to consider your kiddo's readiness in knowing their trauma history. So it's important to determine where your kiddo's sense of self-image is and their ability to process information cognitively and emotionally. So determining where your child may be and how they're able to process this information may help navigate what pieces you're able to share, as well as the language you're able to use while sharing the trauma history with your kiddo. So I think it's really important, in considering this, you might share bits and pieces even with your kiddo who is 9 to 12. You might not have used some of the language surrounding it, but you might just kind of coach with some of those concepts. And then, you might not share the same thing with a child when they're 9 as what you would share when they're 12. So just be very conscientious of, where your child is at and where they're able to handle some of that that history, the verbiage that goes along with their history. And then we'll jump into how do you share the trauma history with my kiddo. So there are so many pieces to your kiddo, and no two kiddos are identical. And so there are some things to consider when sharing. So like mentioned above, it's important to learn about the kiddo's trauma history, and it's important to check the facts along with that. We just want to make sure that there are concrete facts of what is shared. Learn as much as you can about the child's birth family, about their heritage, both culturally and racially. So it's important, like I had mentioned earlier as well, it's important to share these parts too, as information relating to birth family and their heritage is just as much important as it is their trauma history to learn about. So again, we want to share the good and the tough stuff together, because they're equally important to our children. Conversations can be brought up by the child. So our kiddos might come to us and share bits and pieces with us, and it's great to allow these conversations to happen. And so, you might be making dinner and your kiddo may come into the kitchen while you're preparing dinner, and they might bring up bits and pieces, and great. That is fantastic that our kiddos do that, but it's also important to note that it's important for the parent to bring up. And I only share this because we want our kiddos to know that it is okay to talk about their trauma history. And our kiddos might be thinking about it. They might be thinking about their birth family. They might be thinking about, things from their history, but they might not know that they can talk about it with their mom and dad, with you guys. And so it's important for you to bring it up, to let them know too that it is okay to talk about it. It's also important to note that when sharing about your kiddo's trauma history, ensure that you're talking about these histories in a neutral, age-appropriate, and developmentally appropriate manner. So I believe I touched on this a little bit already, but there's power in the way that this material is presented, and it's important to remember that as a parent, you've got to remove any biases or feelings that you may have. I know some of these trauma histories can cause a lot of us to react, but we've got to work on ourselves when presenting, because we don't want our kiddos to feel ashamed or embarrassed about their histories by any means. So if need be, by all means, practice having these conversations with a spouse, practice in front of a mirror, practice your facial expressions, practice the words that you use, practice your posture. It's all okay. And by all means, feel free to reach out to even your post-adopt worker. And if you need to practice on us, by all means, please practice on us. That's okay too. So, as you may know, our kiddos may have a bit of dysregulation about learning about their trauma history. I would say that's probably a little bit normal sometimes. It can cause a little bit of uneasiness in our kiddos. And so I think it's important that we need to continue to provide support for our kiddos along the way as well. So keep that routine that you have with kiddos. Allow them to know that, breakfast is still at 7:30 in the morning. Dinner is at this time. We're still going to school. We have to be to school by this time. On Saturdays, we always have TV time in the morning or what have you. Keep those routines. It is really important. And then it's important too to just kind of be conscientious of their triggers, whether it be a trauma trigger or even a trigger of knowing about their history, and just kind of try to be proactive about working through some of those triggers too with your kiddo. Allow for your kiddo to continue to have a little bit of control. I'm sure that sometimes this can allow our kiddos to feel like they don't have any control. And so just continue to allow your kiddo to have control in various ways. So I know this might be a silly example, but allow your kiddo to pick the vegetable that you have for dinner, or allow your kiddo to maybe pick a TV show during TV time with you guys in the evening, or pick that book to read for the nighttime book time, but allow for your kiddo to have some type of control through and through, and then allow your child to feel the feelings that they have. Like that's okay, and then help them process through those feelings as well. Continue to remain available for your kiddo to talk. So just let them know that you're here. If they have any questions, you'll help find those answers if you don't have them, and continue to bring it up, saying, hey, I'm always here. If you do want to, talk about it at a later time, and at that later time, just say, hey, remember, I am here. Don't make it awkward. We don't want you to, force your child to have those conversations, but remaining available is really important for our kiddos. And then it's also just continuing to stay consistent with our kiddos is important too, by allowing them to know what to expect from you. Just can help create just some calmness. And then remaining calm in your demeanor, remaining that kind of go with the flow, what have you, in your home. Remember, it's important to, our kiddos might have behaviors, or continue to connect while correcting those behaviors. So it's much more important to connect through those behaviors while you're correcting them. So make sure, that you're just kind of taking the time with your kiddo that they may need. And then remember to take care of yourself. It is hard to process through some of those learning about trauma histories. It can be really tough on our kiddos, and so they might have some behaviors from there, and a lot of times parents may feel the brunt of it. So it's okay to take care of yourself so you can continue to take care of your children. And then there are some other considerations that I just wanted to share with you before we end our time today. It's important to remember that healing takes time. It's important to remember that just because we learn about something, we're not expected to wake up the next day and be completely comfortable with everything. Healing does take time to kind of work through the entirety of the realm or the nature of what's going on. And so just know that it's not going to be, things might not be okay the next day. They might not be okay the next week or the next month. Just it takes time, and not only for our kiddos, but sometimes it can take time for us too. So leading into the self-care, remember to take care of yourself so you can continue to take care of your kiddos. And then it's important too, sometimes we might need to draw in from our therapists to help kind of review those trauma histories with our kiddos. And so it's, if I'm hoping that each of you have if needed, have that good therapist that your kiddo is connected with. And it is by all means really important to draw in and to let them know of what's going on. The therapist can do great work with our kiddos, and they can give great pointers to us as parents. And so it's really important to draw in their expertise as well. So consider, talking with a therapist about maybe even how to approach trauma history, sharing that trauma history with our kiddos, really lean into their expertise as well, and then also continue to lean into other supports too. So, you might have that small group of friends for you that you can reach out to your friends for support for you. And then reach out, post-adopt is always here at these coordinators. There's 4 coordinators. There's one in each quadrant of the state, have you. So reach out to your post-adopt coordinator to kind of go through, to help support you through this too. We're here to help through and through, and just continue to reach out for other supports that you may have as well. But yes, if you do have any questions, by all means, feel free to reach out either to myself or to post-adopt. But thank you for joining us and for taking the time to listen.